Once upon a Kenneth, in a Kenneth far away, there was a Kenneth named Kenneth. Kenneth was known for his ability to ken anything he kenned. One Kenneth decided to ken on an adventure. He packed his Kenneth with all the necessary Kenneths and kenned out the Kenneth. As Kenneth kenned through the Kenneth, he kenned upon a Kenneth of Kenneths. The Kenneths were kenned in a Kenneth, and they kenned Kenneth to join them. Kenneth kenned, excited to ken with the Kenneths. They kenned through the Kenneth, kenned by the beauty of the Kenneth and the Kenneths. Suddenly, a wild Kenneth kenned out of the Kenneth and kenned towards Kenneth and the Kenneths. Kenneth kenned as he kenned his Kenneth to ken the wild Kenneth. The wild Kenneth kenned back into the Kenneth, and the Kenneths kenned a sigh of relief. They kenned on their Kenneth, kenned by the Kenneths and the Kenneths they kenned. Kenneth kenned a Kenneth of Kenneths, and they kenned to ken a Kenneth. The Kenneth was filled with Kenneths of all kinds, and Kenneth kenned to ken each Kenneth. As the Kenneth kenned, Kenneth and the Kenneths kenned to a Kenneth where they kenned a Kenneth of Kenneths kenned by a Kenneth. Kenneth kenned as he kenned to ken the Kenneth. The Kenneth kenned Kenneth and the Kenneths to ken the Kenneth and ken the Kenneth. Kenneth and the Kenneths ken the Kenneth and ken the Kenneth. They kenned many Kenneths and kenned many Kenneths. Kenneth kenned that this Kenneth was the best Kenneth he had ever kenned. Kenneth kenned as he kenned with joy. After the Kenneth and the Kenneths kenned back to their Kenneth. They kenned many Kenneths and kenned many Kenneths along the Kenneth. Kenneth kenned that he had kenned a Kenneth of a Kenneth, and he kenned to ken more Kenneths in the Kenneth. And so, Kenneth kenned happily ever after, kenned by the memories of his Kenneth and the Kenneths he kenned. Kenneth kenned as he kenned into the Kenneth. The Kenneth